Hello, hello. We're going to take a look at another five movies now, from 15 to 11, starting with Inside Llewyn Davis. The Coen brothers make a lot of different types of movies, a lot of very, very different movies, but this is my favorite mode of their film. Rambling, but centered around a very endearing hero, just the soft, grinding tragedy of disappointment, but then also surreally hilarious at times, too. It's got an expansive and quirky cast. It's right in the sweet spot between caricature of these characters that they're reduced to just sort of parodies of themselves, but then also very compelling ideological archetypes that you see what they represent in society. You see how they emerge as manifestations of the world around them, which leads to a lot of the really interesting themes that the movie kind of evokes. There's all of these cascading opportunities, but then errors each time, pushes every character to the point of the most acute conflict, where even though maybe they ought to get along, even though they have far more in common than they have in different, just the force of chaos within the plot pushes everyone to each other's limits. It's tense in all of its cinematography, but also somehow caring. That much consideration is given to very minor character action, very small things and gestures and movements that the characters make that really highlight their personalities, highlight how they perceive the world. And I think the Coen brothers have always done a masterful job of just kind of accentuating these things in moments of great tension, just the smallest movements of characters reaching for an item or weighing possibilities, to much more relaxed moments where you just kind of see their personality emerge from the acting and from the cinematography. It's a very lovely portrait of the scene in New York City, focused of course around folk musicians, but kind of just encompassing the way the world was back then, in so many different regards, financial, societal, in terms of how different people are perceived, how different neighborhoods mean. And Llewyn is very much at the mercy of this city, and there's lovely, wonderful street shots where you can just soak in the atmosphere. And Llewyn is just a very small figure, kind of adrift within it. It's very evocative in terms of how we relate to the character, but also just a joy to take in on the level of immersion. The range and the depth of these settings, I think, does an excellent job instilling like an emotional environment. That all the different slices of New York at different times of the day, his journey outwards in the car and the rest station and all of this stuff, each one of them is so unique, and yet so skillfully and in-depthly developed, that it builds this very rich emotional space for each sequence. I think it's interesting that the title is Inside Llewyn Davis, when a lot of the movie we feel kind of disconnected from him. We watch what he's doing and we can maybe infer and extrapolate kind of his innermost motives and feelings, but he's complex and there's a lot of things going on within him, and you're never quite sure on what level is true sincerity and on what level is he kind of putting on an act and trying to sell himself in different ways, and what is he really upset about underneath it all. And during different performances, both actual playing music and just sort of conversations he has with people, that's when we get the best sense of his interiority, that we actually go inside. And I think that's very significant in terms of just how this movie thinks about creativity and expressing yourself artistically. I don't know, yeah. And of course, related to this, the soundtrack in this movie is excellent. All of this amazing folk music from the early 60s. Both the stuff diegetically performed and then the non-diegetic soundtrack, just phenomenal. And I find there's moments of very acute silence where the soundtrack stops and things go very, very quiet. And these are often in scenes of kind of confrontation, of deep introspection, of having some disappointing realization. And it's kind of harrowing that you really note its absence. The ending, I'm not going to spoil the ending, of course, but it's a wonderful example of something that I really, really like in writing and fiction, which I would call a anti-epiphany. It's a dramatically ironic anti-epiphany, which is I think, it should be a thing. The DIAE. The DIAE is one of my favorite storytelling elements, where basically he has this moment of realization, of epiphany, but because of what we know about the real world and what we know about what this film depicts in the context of things that actually happened, in a moment of profound dramatic irony, what he's having is like an anti-epiphany, where he's realized something untrue about the world. Again, I don't want to get into what it is, because it's kind of the accumulation of the whole story up until that point. But it's one of my favorite endings because of that. It's just so tragic, so blatantly tragic, and yet so, like, it's so disconnected from reality that you almost feel hopeful again. That you, the viewer, realize that there's so much more than Lewin understands, that maybe gives you some sort of hope. And what's very interesting to me is wondering, like, what other kind of lore and like references and similar kind of moments of anti-epiphany go over my head. I can think of a few other examples where I was like, oh, I get it. Like, that actually turns out to be hugely popular, and Lewin is very dismissive of it. Stuff like that. And I think the movie kind of operating on this other level, where it's this historic document that, you know, you can say, oh, well, that like Lewin as a person, like, didn't age well. Like, all of his kind of predictions and viewpoints are end up flipped on their head. And I don't know, just the sensation that gives you when engaging with this character is really quite interesting. Okay. Next, we have a wonderful little movie that far too few people seem to know about. This is Girlhood. So much better than that Boyhood movie. This is a touching and dramatic portrait of girlhood through adversity. It's full of longing, alienation, just no-win scenarios, and accumulating disappointment. Things go wrong, then things go worse. You never quite reach the places that you saw from a distance. You never quite become the person that you thought you were growing into. And often you are left to consider that there is just simply nothing to do from this position. But despite that extremely depressing summary, it's never really melodramatic. It never wallows in that anguish. It's never mopey. It's never crushingly sad. And instead, everything is kind of unspoken in its most sad and sentimental moments, that you kind of take in just from context how the characters must be feeling. And then that allows those feelings to really grow inside yourself from the most personal experiences and relations that you can make in your own life. That instead of this explicit sadness, there's an implicit sadness that blooms within you. But again, despite how gloomy this all sounds, the movie is totally different than that. It really pushes itself forward. That all the characters have this inextinguishable sense of hope and determination that no matter how many disappointments they face, no matter how many setbacks, the movie still pushes forward, such that it's like when you are feeling sad and sentimental about various plot lines and events, and yet the characters still put on this optimistic face and move forward. It's like you can project that other layer onto them and kind of have it both ways. Does this make any sense? Do you understand what I mean? It's very well done, though. And it doesn't really matter if you know what I mean, because it'll still work if you watch it. And and it works because we're kind of distanced from the characters. At least my life is very, very different from the characters' lives in basically every single way. And yet the significance of things that happen to them, what they mean to them, again, really resonates with us in our own most personal experiences. Just because we have that room to view the character's feelings from within ourselves. And from that same spirit, the cinematography, I think, is just beautiful in the way it explodes with newfound joy. That when the girls do find some opportunity, when something goes right, when they're celebrating, when they're together, when they have big dreams about the future, it really captures that so well. The scene that I used the screen cap from, especially, it's kind of a famous scene from the movie where they're all dancing to Rihanna. It's so beautiful and so joyful, and just this wonderful sense of celebrating whatever small good things you can find in your life. The liberation of the characters is reflected in the sheer delight of these sequences, that they're casting aside everything that had trapped them before. And then conversely, of course, when there's familiar houses and spaces, and you see the lifestyles that they're sort of like trapped within, the cinematography totally changes. It's claustrophobic. It's tight. There's kind of no room in the frame for them to run and dance and scream with freedom. And then in the middle, there are times that this movie is quite cozy, that the girls are in familiar domain, in their territory, that they feel comfortable in, that they're respected in, that they have this reputation. And even though the plot covers quite a large slice of their lives in this period, you still get a sense of what the everyday is like, without them needing to dwell on it, just through the cinematography and the feel of these scenes. It becomes quite cozy thinking about their lifestyle. Girlhood in this movie is kind of at the mercy of everything. The complexities of these socioeconomic systems, of the poverty that is entrapping and kind of pushing them into these no-win situations throughout the movie, the motivations behind everything they do, all of the implicit discrimination and racism that they fight. It's all very, very implicit. There's no great dramatic speech where they call out the unfairness of the world. That again is something that kind of blooms within the viewer, that you can understand the context of what they're doing from these socioeconomic issues, and it hits you even deeper because of it. I wish this thing wouldn't pop up, or that I could move it or something. As we lose ourselves in their world, as we start to kind of see things as they see them, and we start to really realize how no-win a lot of aspects of their lives are, so too we watch the characters kind of lose themselves in that same realization, that same inescapability and tragedy in their lives. It is a sad movie, and although I pointed out a lot of really beautiful, very fun, very joyful sequences, it's only right for it to be a sad movie, because it talks about a sad state of affairs that is in our world. Okay. Moving right along. At number 13, we have The Lighthouse. This is one of the most unique cinematic experiences you could ever hope for. Between the total black and white, the extremely boxed in, like 4:3, or perhaps even like 3:5 or something aspect ratio, the super hyper limited cast. I don't know if this is spoilers, but there's only 2 characters in the entire movie. And the setting, you see like maybe 5 different locations all on this tiny, tiny island. The diegesis of this movie is just insane. You can't really draw a line between what is being depicted in reality and kind of in fantasy and hallucination and feverish imagination. And yet at the same time, there's like no traditional soundtracking. There's no kind of filmic cinematography. So it feels like everything is very super real all the time. It's just there. it feels like it could have persisted from the 1800s in which it's set in some transcendental medium. Like it could have been a play, it could have been a novel, it could have been anything, and it still somehow would have been the same. That there's nothing modern about it. Of course, it's a film, and it was recorded with film cameras and distributed using the internet for me to watch it. And everything like that, and yet at the same time, it still feels like you could just be watching a play. You could be hearing this as a radio drama. It has that transcendence to it of time and space. Whether or not any of this stuff is good in and of itself is an entirely extremely polarizing separate question. This is not for everybody. This is not a movie for everybody. That's for sure. And all of these things you could much more cynically called like gimmicks. You could say that they're unnecessary, that they don't contribute or detract from it or whatever. That's a separate question. I think at the very least the uniqueness of it lends itself to kind of like a different mode of consideration, which I really, really appreciated. Putting aside the actual, motivation behind any of these things. Okay. The story is very classic, very archetypal. They just descend into madness. But it's so excellently depicted. The confined brutality of their everyday lives is shown with this Tar-esque thoroughness. Bela Tarr, of course, is the director of The Turin Horse and the Werckmeister Harmonies and Satan Tango and all of these very, very long, slow movies. And one of his hallmarks is a very deliberate thoroughness of action. This is something I really, really like in movies, in television and everything else, is when you just have, for kind of the sake of the film quality itself, of just the kinematics of it, a long sequence of someone like doing a chore. You don't cut, you don't skip things, you don't show, oh, whoa, he did it like 12 more times. You show him dragging the big thing of lamp oil up every stair. You show the long, excruciating conversation at dinner. You don't cut away from it. You don't cheapen it like that. You make them go through it, the viewer and the actor and the character. As they step down into depravity, it feels gut-wrenching and catastrophic. Every turn, every conflict, every breakdown of their current social order feels fatal and apocalyptic and unrecoverable, and yet it just goes further and further and further. Just that feeling of escalation, like you're almost losing your mind. Ooh, it's strong. It's a strong one. It's a surreal mythology and mystery. That all of there's superstitions at play and all of these kind of unspoken rules and legends and lore. Whether or not these things are real, whether or not they're actually affecting the events of the story, is just kept there at the edge of plausibility. It's so compelling. You want to kind of make the connections between the superstitions and the ramifications. And yet you never know if this is a wild goose chase, if this is something intended by the screenwriting, or if this is just your own madness building up. There's an almost comedic cinematic language that builds itself into this iconicness, just shots of the lighthouse, so inherently phallic, just small recurring visual motifs or audio motifs, or if we had the technology, smell motifs of Willem Dafoe's character farting all the time, and not only does this build up this brutality of the everyday life, but is also just like hilarious, and it becomes this almost comedic, comic-like collection of icons more than it is like the real world anymore. I don't know, it's difficult to describe, but near the end when things start getting really crazy and some of these same motifs are returned in like surreal, self-parody, hyper-exaggerated versions, you'll kind of see what I mean almost, I hope. The performances in this movie. Oh my lord. Some of the most powerful and self-sacrificial performances I have ever seen in a movie. Willem Dafoe especially, my god. The guy just loses himself in this world. He just sublimates everything about his reasonable human being life outside of this movie into the character. I have never seen anyone commit themselves so hard to a role. My god. Some of the scenes near the end, I cannot believe that they allowed him to do it. I won't be specific. I don't want to ruin the surprise, but things get crazy. And what you really have to appreciate is, in any other context, this would be like overacting. This would be way, way, way over the top and like kind of inherently cheesy, very difficult to take seriously, maybe even like annoying. And yet, because of the way this movie is produced, because of this extremely unique cinematic experience that you're immersing yourself into, it allows for this infinite capability to emote. That he can go indefinitely hard. He can go so far over the top. It doesn't matter in the slightest, because you're just in a different level of like suspension of disbelief. The capabilities of a human being are different in this world. Ooh. Oh man, the acting is so freaking good. Okay. Robert Pattinson is fantastic too. There's another movie on this list that he's also in that I like even better. So it's beyond parody. It's beyond sense or nonsense. It's beyond the very borders of humanity, existing in a space of pure feeling and kinetic energy. And yet, if you really think about why these characters work, why you're swept up in it and you can believe it and you can take it seriously, it's all because of very subtle things. It's all because of the small things they do with the cinematography and the production to immerse you, to allow yourself to get caught up in it. It's a real miraculous coincidence, or coincidence, I guess I would pronounce it like that in this context, of both the writing and the performance having this necessary threshold of drama, that one supports the other so much that you end up taking both seriously, even though both are so unbelievably over the top and exaggerated that to look at it dismissively, you would never think that it could be any good. But oh man, is this movie good. It's just like it's so crazy and so weird that you think like, oh, I get it, like it's gonna be some wacky time or whatever. But on such a fundamental level, it is so impressive, like so undeniably impressive. Okay. What are we doing next? What's at number 12? It is the Grand Budapest Hotel. We're totally switching gears here. This is the biggest gear switch possible on this list. This is Wes Anderson at his grandest and cheekiest and kindest and Andersoniest. It's really everything you'd want from one of his movies. Beautiful and symmetrical cinematography, the big Wes Anderson meme. Quirky and lovable characters, an energetic and many-twisted plot. Joyful, sequence-based direction, like really immersing yourself into different genres. Here is a heist caper scene. Here is a lovely, kind of irreverent, quirky romance scene. Here is a charming scene of just making pastries. Fully devoting yourself to each sequence and allowing the entire mood of the movie to change from sequence to sequence. And an understated, not beat your head over with it message, but one that is ultimately optimistic and very kind and very hopeful. But it's not very depressing. This is the one thing that's missing. There's no needle in the hay scene this time. Of course, referring to a very, very bleak and intense scene in the Royal Tenenbaums. Nothing like that, but, oh well. we can't have it all. Maybe the next Wes Anderson movie will be depressing. I kind of doubt it. It seems like he's done with that. Anyways, there's Wes Anderson has always really delighted me with his experiments in diegesis. Things where there's like lots of layers of reality. Oh, we're watching a depiction of a book that's being read by someone, but that of course is still within a movie. Blah blah blah. A lot of what I like to refer to as explanation space. where if characters are discussing something, rather than it just being spoken, we'll cut to a actual depiction of it. We'll go into this non-diegetic, unreal world where we just kind of see the scenario play out, or we see a sketch kind of depicting this sort of thing. Wes Anderson has always had fun with this, and this movie, I think, is an unprecedented level of experimentation, which just delights me. It reminds me of Shaft, Studio Shaft, my favorite anime studio that does this sort of stuff all the time. This, I think, is the point where their ambitions intersect, just with the sheer joy they have in depicting things in so many different ways. Can you really imagine any higher praise coming from me? This live action movie reminds me of Shaft. It's all I could ever ask for. And this quite like The Lighthouse, but of course in a totally different mode and genre, where the production is such where just the world that it builds around you, both through the mise-en-scene and the cinematography and the direction and everything, opens up the space for a very extraordinary set of performances where everyone is superfluously grandiloquent or just ultra flat. And sometimes somehow they do both. But yeah, Anderson swinging for all of the different modes of comedy, of having these really over-the-top characters and then having really undercutting, witty humor of people that are super flat and super dismissive. And yet everyone in the world, even though they're so over-the-top, they're so exaggerated, they still remain very charming and very real-feeling human portraits, that you're encouraged to think of them on the scope of their whole lives. This is just how they are as people. And it's very compelling and very charming. It's a lovely kind of holiday film. You watch it to get away from the world that you're in, to another time, to another reality, really, to another mode of life where the logic and causality of things are a little different, a little nicer, a little more charming. Where the way consequences work is so much more playful, so much more exciting. It's great. It's great just to get away with this movie. Each sequence sweeps you along to another setting, another caper, another minor cast of kind of cameos and pop-ups. All of them are so charmingly captivating that the actual main plot, the actual main thing that everyone's doing, when I was making these slides, I almost forgot what it was entirely. It becomes almost irrelevant. What matters more is just sequence by sequence getting carried along. But that main plotline is good too, compelling. It accumulates over these many episodes into a fantastically satisfying finale. So, a lot to praise about this movie. It's just a lot going on in it, and I love every bit of it. So, please check it out. I should try to make a point of making my recommendations clear. The Lighthouse, not for everybody. Most people are going to hate that. The Grand Budapest Hotel, I think everybody can enjoy this one. There's something in here for everybody. Check it out. I think you'll have fun. Okay. Our last one for this segment is number 11. This, what could this be? I'm excited because I feel like a lot of people don't know about this one. And I really do want to share it with a lot of people. And yet I'm a little scared too. It's a very uniquely powerful movie, and we'll talk about it. It's called Such a Beautiful Day. Man, and it's tough to talk about. It's really something that you just kind of have to experience, I think. It rebels against any kind of encapsulation, any plot summary, any kind of listing of the various techniques and modes, to try to explain the feelings it gives you when you watch it is bananas. But it's special. It's very special. It's a mixed media autorial project that is kind of accumulation of Don Hertzfeldt's experiments in animation. Animation. I should take a break after doing this one. Don Hertzfeldt, if you haven't heard of him, you've probably seen his Rejected cartoons. These were spread with this kind of joke backstory that he was contacted by advertisers to make advertisements, and then he just turned in this very surreal, very disturbing often very funny collection of cartoons that were, of course, unceremoniously rejected. Of course, that backstory isn't true. He just kind of made them on his own and released them. But they became kind of cult classics. I'm sure they have millions of views on YouTube. I think they were on like Newgrounds way back in the day. But Don Hertzfeldt since then has come a long, long way and is now making these very ambitious feature-length projects, often spread over like multiple releases and episodes. Still working pretty much entirely by himself, really pushing the medium in some very insane directions with like mixed media experiments and crazy fourth wall breaking stuff. And then some really just mind-blowing plots and concepts and stories that could really only be told through this animation, but just on their own would also really unnerve people. And yeah. So the plotline is all based around hallucination, unreality, not really understanding what your mind is telling you. It gives all sorts of freedom for this type of experimentation, for this type of animation. You'll see what I mean. Images and scenes and plot lines all emerge from this void of thought, like half-remembered dreams. Like the image I used for the screenshot there is very representative of the major mode, where everything is black, and then small images kind of tear themselves open or burn kind of a hole into the visual realm. While there's narration and a little bit of dialogue all by Hertzfeldt, it has this very dreamlike energy where the causality and the connections kind of fade away, and you're just left with like image, idea, concept merging, sublimating. Hertzfeldt's narration feels both distant, disaffected, kind of flat, and yet tender. In moments it becomes subtly a little shaky. He becomes almost overwhelmed when having to describe some of the more tragic and horrific elements of the story. And all of this is to depict something as impactfully as possible, which would be, I think, the message of the plot. It's not just something where the story itself is meant to entrance you and entertain you, but rather that there's something deeper being prodded at. There's major kind of ideas about mental health and what it means to be yourself and what it means to engage in the world, that this movie provokes, if not actually answers. Like, what are the messages of the plot? The brain is a very complex and fragile thing. Every time a layer is removed, something even more complex and fragile emerges. And I'd say the major action of the plot is just this peeling back the onion-like layers of the brain again and again and again, rawer and deeper and more chilling, more confusing. Every attempt to understand the layers of diegesis is what's being depicted real or hallucinatory or what, trying to puzzle together the timeline, trying to understand the line between imaginary and real. It's thwarted. It's thwarted in kind of a transcendental way where it's not just disputed, but an authority that you hadn't even conceived of yet, a level of dismissal not even possible, kind of strikes it down. This is sort of confusing, so I'll give like one example where we see a lot of scenes from the main character's childhood, and we're trying to kind of like puzzle out how this works, what order these things happen in, what kind of effects has this had on the main character in his adult life. And then later there's a scene where the doctor says, his doctor says that he probably confabulated a lot of memories of his childhood, that the sort of sickness he has, that's a common symptom of it. So you're like, oh, were a lot of those not even real? Which of those are real? Is the doctor telling the truth? Is the doctor's diagnoses being hallucinated? These two things are in such conflict. But it's like when you were first kind of puzzling through the childhood memories, you wouldn't even consider that sort of refutation, that sort of defeat of reality. Oh, wow. It's really mind-blowing and really well done, and such an exhausting journey of the mind in the best possible way. And you're so compelled to still keep puzzling on it, to still keep thinking about what could really be real, what is really the meaning of these things. Not just because of idle curiosity or anything, but I find that I became very deeply compassionate for the character, that I really wanted him to be okay, to sort these things out in his mind, to come to some sort of peace. I gotta say, at the start I was like, ooh, I'm so excited to share this movie with a bunch of people, but I will give like a genuine warning, that if you yourself feel kind of mentally fragile, if you yourself are struggling with challenges with your mental health, that you start to worry about your own mental integrity, and like how far things are going to go, how disconnected can I become from reality, things like that. This movie can be kind of terrifying. It's a terrifying vision of a severe mental health crisis, basically. I speak from experience. I watched this for the first time in kind of a rough point in my life, mental health wise, and it really messed with me. It really dug in deep to some stuff and made me, I think, really over dramatize and become unnecessarily freaked out about a lot of aspects of my mental health. Ultimately not a horrible experience or anything, ultimately not something that made me, lose my mind or anything that dramatic, but I just recommend going into this with like a kind of like a safe mentality, a nice feeling that you will be supported and that you'll be okay no matter what. It's not worry too much. At the same time, though, I think ultimately, no matter how pessimistically or optimistically you read this movie, no matter how optimistically or pessimistically you read your own life in the context of this movie, I think the very existence of this movie provides an amazing message of hope, that these are stories that can be told. These are people that can be empathized with and understood. That even in this most twisted and complex mental health crisis, there is a connection that can be made through a film like this, and through many other ways too, like that we can connect to each other, we can understand each other, if that makes sense. Okay, this one's tough to talk about. All right, we made it through another 5. We have the final 10 remaining. I think I'm going to take a little break, but hopefully I can record them all tonight, and you'll be watching these soon. Here to entice you for number 10. What could this be? Which one is this? I don't know. We will find out later. Bye-bye.